American presidency, though it retains some of the aura of kingship, is an elective office deliberately distinct from monarchy. And yet, even in America, politics often runs in families, and certain prominent families have come to dominate the high office. The first such lineage produced was the Adams family of Massachusetts. John Adams set out to create an American dynasty, raising his oldest son, John Quincy, to one day inherit the presidency.
I cannot escape my destiny. I am bound to my parents by more than ordinary ties.
The children of presidents historically have had a very difficult time living up to the reputations and experiences of their parents. It's not a promising prospect. Most children have not been able to get enough distance to manage careers of their own that bring them within sight, sound, or possibility of the presidency. So this says something for John Adams as well as John Quincy Adams, that he let his son grow up.
John Quincy Adams was raised at the family homestead in Quincy, Massachusetts, where his famous parents put huge pressure on him to succeed. His father lectured, "If you do not rise to the head of your country, it will be owing to your own laziness and slovenliness."
The first and deepest of all my wishes is to give satisfaction to my parents.
Forced by his demanding parents to grow up fast, by the time he reached his 20s, John Quincy was appointed America's minister to Holland. And in time, President Washington called him the most valuable public character we have abroad. Then, during his father's presidency, he served ably for 4 years as minister to Prussia. In 1801, when his father retired from the presidency, John Quincy returned to the United States to settle down on the family homestead.
I feel an attachment to these places more powerful than to any other spot upon earth.
But by now, the first of many family tragedies had struck the Adamses. John Quincy's brother Charles, unable to live up to the family ideal, had succumbed to alcoholism.
The death of my brother affected me greatly. Now there is no passion more deeply rooted in my bosom than the longing for posterity to support my father's name.
Elected to the upper house of the Massachusetts legislature, 1 year later he won a seat in the U.S. Senate. And in 1809, he was named Minister to Russia. Now recognized as the country's most skilled diplomat, it was John Quincy who negotiated the close of the War of 1812. In recognition of his accomplishments, he was named James Monroe's top cabinet officer. He proved himself to be a brilliant Secretary of State, perhaps the finest in American history.
The Secretary of State always inherited the presidency. He knew it was his task to go on to be president. I think this was a man who was testing himself and watching himself and being uncomfortable about his obligations throughout his public life.
Make no mistake about it, the 4 most miserable years of my life were my 4 years in the presidency.
He was one of the brightest men ever to enter high office, and his administration was marked by its bold initiatives. He advocated federally funded roads, canals, river widenings, and harbor works. But Adams's introverted ways and arrogant intellectual manner overshadowed his many achievements, and he became vilified as one of the country's most unpopular presidents ever.
I well know that I was never a popular man. I am reproached as a gloomy misanthropist and an unsocial savage. But I am not formed to shine in company. I have no powers of fascination, none of the honey which is the true flycatcher. I am a silent animal.
John Quincy Adams seemed to be more comfortable around plants than people. Horticulture was his passion, and he was the first president to begin what would become an ongoing tradition of formal plantings around the White House. Throughout his presidency, Adams took long walks by himself and swam alone in the Potomac River.
Almost every day I have bathed in the river and swum up to an hour and a half. On the morning of July 4, 1826, I received a letter announcing that my father was rapidly sinking. I immediately determined to proceed as speedily as possible to Quincy.
But the president was too late. John Quincy reached the family homestead on July 13th, 6 days after his father's funeral.
Everything about the house was the same. I was not fully sensible of the change till I entered his bedchamber. That moment struck me as if it had been an arrow to my heart. The charm which has always made this house to me an abode of enchantment is dissolved. And yet my attachment to it is stronger than I have ever felt it before.
2 years later, the so-called People's candidate, Andrew Jackson, vowed to topple the Adams administration and everything it stood for. Following one of the bitterest fights in presidential campaign history, John Quincy was defeated by a large majority. "My career is closed," he wrote dejectedly. His hopes now focused on his children.
My sons have the honor of 2 preceding generations to sustain. I had hoped that at least one of my sons would have been ambitious to excel. Instead, I find all 3 coming to manhood with indolent minds. It is a bitter disappointment. I am aware that no labor will ever turn a pebble into a diamond.
Recently, his son George had begun drinking, gambling, and womanizing. "I have been horror-struck at your danger," Adams had written. "May I remind you of the blood from which you came." But when he demanded that George come talk over his life, his confused oldest son leapt to his death from aboard a steamboat.
Oh, my unhappy son, what a paradise of earthly enjoyment I had figured as awaiting thee and me. It is withered forever.
The Adamses passed on from one generation to the next, enlarging neuroses, which got more problematical with each successive generation. Fathers in office are so perpetually occupied that sons get neither the attention nor the direction they deserve.
No one knows the agony of mind that I suffered. It was like roasting to death by a slow fire.
It was his religious faith that finally brought him around. That and a distinct honor awarded him in 1831 by the people of Massachusetts, who elected him as a representative to the U.S. Congress. He became the only former president ever to serve in the House of Representatives.
No election or appointment ever gave me so much pleasure. My election as president was not half so gratifying.
And so commenced the final chapter in John Quincy's long life. He served brilliantly in Congress for the next 17 years. And though his second son, John, also died from alcoholism, his youngest son, Charles Francis, would one day go on to become, like his father, a distinguished diplomat and a congressman.
All my hopes in this world are now centered upon him. I would die despondent if I were under the conviction that no remaining drop of my father's blood transmitted through me would survive.
John Quincy once swore he would die in the pursuit of duty, and in 1848 he received his wish, suffering a severe stroke on the floor of the House of Representatives. To the end, it was his family that had kept him going. That and a lifelong ambition that destroyed so many other Adamses. To have earned the right to be called his father's son. After the Adamses, the Harrison family was the country's foremost political dynasty. William Henry Harrison was the son of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. The hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe in the War of 1812, he went on to become the country's 9th president. Then, half a century later, his grandson also rose to the high office. He was our 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison.
I have only a vague memory of my grandfather, as I was only a child when he died. But I will show all that my family's famous name is safe in my keeping.
Benjamin Harrison was a disciplined, dispassionate, proper individual, and one of the finest lawyers in the Midwest. But the very qualities that made him excel, his methodical approach, his absorption in logic and detail, his unwillingness to delegate, turned him into an over-efficient workhorse with little sense of fun.
I do the same thing every day, eat 3 meals, sleep 6 hours, and read dusty old books the rest of the time. My life is about as barren of anything funny as the great desert is of grass.
Because of his grandfather's reputation as a famous general, much was expected of Benjamin during the Civil War. Intent on proving himself worthy of his heritage, he fought in more battles in 6 months than his grandfather had in a lifetime. Returning to his law practice after the war, he became a force in Republican politics. In 1881, he won a seat in the U.S. Senate, and just 7 years later, he won the Republican nomination for president. A gifted orator, he told his party he wanted a low-key campaign with as little emphasis placed on himself as possible, and with no mention at all of his famous ancestry.
I want to avoid everything that is personal, and I want it understood I am grandson of nobody.
But against his wishes, Harrison's managers insisted on making the connection to his famous grandfather.
Tip, tip, Tippecanoe, true blue.
Campaign posters referred to Tippecanoe. Keep the Ball Rolling had been William Henry's campaign theme. Now the giant ball of his grandfather's day was recreated so that the grandson could also push it to victory. The only time in the campaign Harrison spoke at all of his family was to a delegation of his grandfather's troops, now old men, who arrived at his front porch.
I know the respect and even affection which you bore to my grandfather. May I not now say that you have since created a modest respect for me?
Like his grandfather, Benjamin Harrison defeated a sitting president, coming in second to Grover Cleveland in the popular vote in 1888. He won in the Electoral College and was pronounced the new chief executive. But right from the start, Harrison found the presidency frustrating. His reclusive personality was not suited for the office, especially the part of the job involving people, and they came to see him in droves.
It is a frightful ordeal filling the offices in the country. The applicants for office are generally respectable, and many of them are personal friends. But the president cannot aid every needy person, and I made myself unpopular.
Benjamin Harrison was known colloquially at the time as the icebox. He is probably the coldest fish we ever had in the presidency. colder by far even than John Quincy Adams. Harrison, it is said, came to despise the presidency, to hate the office in which he had to serve. But our most successful presidents, our most effective presidents, have absolutely adored the presidency, adored every minute of the day. There may be a lesson in that.
With blue eyes and a reddish-gray beard, at 5'6", Harrison was only slightly taller than the shortest president, James Madison. Critics began to say he could never fill the hat of his famous grandfather, and that a microscope was needed to examine so insignificant a figure. And as criticism intensified, the White House began to seem like a prison.
It is an office and a home combined, an evil combination. It is open to visitors from 10 a.m. till 2 without card or introduction. The grounds are practically a public park. There's not a square foot, not a bench, nor a shade tree that the president or his family can use in privacy.
Unwilling to delegate responsibility, Harrison tried to do the job single-handedly. He overshadowed his cabinet officers, outraged deserving politicians by ignoring them, and assumed an annoying superior manner. Outside for a stroll, he would walk with his eyes on the sky to avoid having to acknowledge well-wishers. Once, when a friend pleaded, "For God's sake, be human," he answered, "I tried it but failed. I'll never try again." As the 1892 election approached, his prospects for a second term appeared dim. Running against him once again was Grover Cleveland, making it the only time ever that both candidates had been president. But in the midst of the re-election campaign, Harrison's wife Caroline developed tuberculosis. Dropping presidential obligations, the president nursed her himself, spending whole nights by her bedside in the White House. Observers said he was red-eyed from constant weeping.
Anxiety about her makes my interest in public matters very small.
Just 2 weeks before the election, Caroline died. And with her went the remainder of Harrison's ambition. When he lost the election, it came as a relief. Now all he wanted was to leave Washington and return home to Indianapolis.
After the heavy blow of the death of my wife, I do not think I could have stood re-election.
In retirement, Harrison attempted to rebuild a family, marrying his wife's young niece 3 years after leaving office. But in doing so, he became permanently estranged from his grown children. The following year, the couple had a daughter, Elizabeth, who brightened the former president's last years.
I have sometimes thought that the life of the president is like that of the policeman in the opera, not a happy one. For nearly 60 years of my life, I was driven by work. I want hereafter to do the driving myself.
In striking contrast to the Harrison family was the dynasty of the Roosevelts. Theodore Roosevelt charged into office 8 years after Harrison, staking out the White House as family territory. And no one ever felt more at home there than did TR's cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
We've had no other president that I can think of, except our first president, George Washington, who had such a sense of possession by right. Being president was being FDR. and he had nothing to live up to. He was it. He saw the presidency as almost a family property. FDR thought of the country as his patrimony.
The secret of Roosevelt's extraordinary self-confidence lay in his secure childhood near Hyde Park, New York. A 900-acre family estate on the Hudson River became his lifelong spiritual heart and center.
I received a love and devotion that were perfect, and a companionship that was rare in quality between parent and child.
In 1905, he married his fifth cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the favorite niece of President Theodore Roosevelt, who came up from Washington to give the bride away. Pulling Franklin aside, he said, "There's nothing like keeping the name in the family."
Teddy Roosevelt had made a strong bid for the proposition that the, quote, best people in the country had, as a matter of noblesse oblige, to engage in public life, to try to lead it. And he preached it all through Franklin's adolescence and young manhood with increasing success. It's my belief, although I cannot prove it, that from the time Franklin entered college, he had his mind fixed, his eye fixed on the White House. It was the natural setting for him. It was his home. It was Eleanor's uncle's place.
When Franklin entered politics, he patterned his career and campaign style after Theodore Roosevelt. It didn't matter that they belonged to different parties. Family ties were far stronger than political ties. He told the same stories, peppered his speeches with the word bully, began wearing the same style of eyeglasses, and went on well-publicized hunting trips. 2 terms in the New York State Legislature came first, then 7 years as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. It was the same political route to the presidency that his famous cousin had taken. Hyde Park was transformed into his base of operations. There, an increasingly secretive Roosevelt became known as a skilled and cagey politician.
I am a juggler, and I never let my right hand know what my left hand does.
Juggling his home life as well, he and Eleanor had 6 children over 10 years. But in 1918, their seemingly perfect life fell apart when Eleanor discovered he was having an affair with her social secretary. From then on, Eleanor agreed to support her husband publicly, but privately their relationship turned cool and purely professional. 2 years later, Franklin was soundly defeated by Warren Harding when he ran as the Democratic nominee for vice president alongside James M. Cox. At age 39, he had come to what seemed to be the end of the road, both personally and professionally. That summer, his bad luck grew even worse. Franklin contracted polio, which was then America's most dreaded disease. Although both his legs were completely paralyzed, he denied there was anything permanently wrong. At Hyde Park, it took months and a deep depression before he was able to deal with his plight. As months turned into years, Roosevelt seemed to age rapidly. Staying out of the political arena for a decade, his sole focus was to try and overcome his disability. In 1927, Roosevelt purchased an old resort in Warm Springs, Georgia, and opened a therapeutic center for polio victims.
He fought his way back, not to complete health. His legs were never worth a damn. But the fundamental thing that made Roosevelt what he turned into as president was his struggle to overcome this crippling illness. It changed him into a man of deep determination, enormous determination, and also enormous empathy for the struggles and problems of other people.
The following year, Franklin Roosevelt got back into politics. Tracing Theodore Roosevelt's course once again, he was elected governor of New York. Grabbing the strong arm of a son while bracing himself with a cane, he was actually able to make it appear as if he were walking.
I am able to walk only with great difficulty, with steel braces and crutches, having to be carried up and down stairs, in and out of cars.
Through it all, the great performer put on a mask of joviality and patience in the face of frustration and pain. Allowing newsreel cameras into Hyde Park, he cleverly modeled his estate into the symbol of who he was. Hyde Park was where he vacationed, where he conducted his most important business, where he made many of his most memorable announcements, and where he set up his campaign headquarters to run for the presidency.
It's our campaign slogan, Sister.
Happy days are here again.
Good, that's right.
In 1932, promising to restore prosperity in the midst of the worst depression the country had ever faced, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was named the Democratic nominee for President of the United States.
That from this date on, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
As Franklin Roosevelt campaigned, a quarter of the labor force was unemployed, and banks all across the country were closing down. By Inauguration Day, the economy had hit bottom. All eyes were on the new president to see how he would respond.
I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
And then he won the nation's heart, saying, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." As Roosevelt assumed office, a grateful Congress responded by granting him its full support. And in just 14 weeks, 15 major bills were passed.
It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something.
FDR's New Deal forced the country to take responsibility for its citizens, creating unemployment relief, a massive public works program, a shoring up of the banking system, and eventually Social Security for millions of Americans.
He made himself almost a father figure. He brought his own confidence to office and infused it into the country. And that was an enormous contribution, an absolutely critical contribution. Eleanor Roosevelt never let FDR forget the disadvantaged in the society, especially concerning the employment rights of blacks and women. She badgered him unmercifully sometimes.
Eleanor Roosevelt was a new kind of First Lady who traveled the world as the President's ambassador. And though they led largely separate private lives, he admired her so much she became his most valued advisor. He once called her the most extraordinarily interesting woman he had ever met. Like his cousin, Roosevelt ran the White House like a big, informal boarding house, with its doors thrown open to family and friends. And he had the same command Theodore Roosevelt had had over the press. But now, because of radio, the president could do something his cousin could never do: talk directly to the American people in what became known as his fireside chats.
It is your problem, my friends, no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
Embraced warmly by the American public, Roosevelt successfully campaigned for re-election in 1936. And in 1940, he went on to do what no other president has ever done: win election to a third term. With war now raging in Europe and Asia, Americans knew they couldn't afford to lose FDR's proven leadership in time of crisis. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Hitler declared war against the United States. And once again, Roosevelt would have to rally the nation.
We are now in this war. We are all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history.
With consummate skill, Roosevelt led the war effort, even at the expense of his own health. Forging an unbreakable alliance with Great Britain and risking a wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, he turned the tide against Hitler. The man who more than any other single person saved democracy in the 20th century became the acknowledged leader of the free world. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called him the greatest man I have ever known. By the time Franklin Roosevelt was elected to an unprecedented fourth term, his face showed the signs of the toll of 12 years in office. By now, he had given everything he had. The strength and energy that had carried the nation was gone. Weak and in failing health, he asked that his fourth inauguration be held at the White House to make it easier on him.
Do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability.
Just 82 days later, he collapsed of a cerebral hemorrhage. He would never see the end of the war, nor his dream, the United Nations, coming to being, nor the new world order he had attempted to create. But he had made an indelible mark upon the world. The New York Times proclaimed, "Men will thank God on their knees 100 years from now that Franklin D. Roosevelt was in the White House."
Franklin Roosevelt will be remembered always, I think, as a great president because he fulfilled the first requisite of, quote, greatness, unquote. He lived in great, difficult times. He assumed the mantle of fatherhood for the country, and the country responded gratefully. One has to go all the way back to understand how a person does such a thing naturally. And I've always assumed that part of the answer lies in the total security of his childhood, and as a memory, as an image, it may have contributed something to Franklin Roosevelt's stance in those periods of crisis. I can't prove that, but I've always suspected it.
In the end, Hyde Park and FDR had become one and the same. Once someone had asked how, with the knowledge that he would never walk again, he ever got himself to sleep. He answered, "It's very easy. I coast down the hills in the snow, and then I walk slowly up, and I know every curve.
All that is in me goes back to the Hudson and to the days as a boy in Hyde Park.
The Roosevelts, like the Adamses and the Harrisons, were native aristocrats, part of America's Protestant establishment. The fourth great political dynasty to produce an American president was Irish Catholic and had to seize its place in American history. It was the family of John F. Kennedy.
The Kennedy family was not at all like the Roosevelt family. Oh, its origins were, of course, in the Irish famine. The one place which became a source of real family roots was their summer home in Hyannisport on Cape Cod, which Joe Kennedy had bought in the late 20s. He had bought it in a WASP community, and he was not a very welcome neighbor. It is Joe Kennedy who created the tight bonds, the warmth, the competitiveness, and the concern for public service that penetrated the lives of all his children, not least Jack.
My father was very active in politics during our formative years. My grandfather was in Congress and was mayor of Boston. My other grandfather was in the state senate. I had 4 great uncles who were also in the state house or state senate in Massachusetts. And all the discussions at our table growing up were about government and political life.
Though Jack's father would serve as FDR's ambassador to Great Britain, he was always frustrated, believing his Irish Catholic roots had held him back from presidential politics. So he focused his hopes on his children. "We want winners," he told them. "We don't want losers around here." Home life was defined by constant verbal testing, competitive athletics, iron discipline, and no sympathy. But early on, Jack Kennedy was detached and careless, more independent than his brothers and sisters. He was sickly and frail, suffering from spinal problems and asthma. When he attended Harvard, his older brother Joe overshadowed him in everything he did.
I was not very active in politics at Harvard, and I don't think that there was any indication that I was going to adopt it as a career. I was always interested in writing. I wanted to teach for a while, so that really the war changed my life, and I suppose if it hadn't been for that and what happened then, I suppose I would have gone on with my original plans.
What happened was that Jack's brother Joe was killed in action while flying a secret mission.
Old Joe Kennedy had always intended that his eldest son, Joe, would ultimately make the run for the presidency and vindicate the Irish in the highest office in the United States. Joe's influence had been striking, I believe, first in convincing young Jack that he shouldn't pursue a journalistic career, but having lost his brother in the war, should take his place in politics.
From the start, first as a congressman, then as a senator, Jack Kennedy's popularity rating soared.
I ran in 1946 and was successful, and then ran again in 48, 50, and won then, and then again in 1952. Someone has said that you really don't understand politics until you've been defeated, and then all the mysteries become apparent. But I've had very good luck, and I think it's better this way.
America's most eligible bachelor became even more popular when he married Jacqueline Bouvier in 1952. Her style and grace complemented his style and grace. Now all the ingredients were in place for a meteoric rise to the White House.
Well, after 1956, I was a candidate for the vice presidency. And then after the Democrats lost in 56, I began to think that maybe I would run in 1960.
As Jack Kennedy campaigned for president, it was joked he was running on the family plan. Joe Kennedy not only helped pay for it, he pulled important political strings from behind the scenes. And every member of the Kennedy family actively campaigned.
Well, this week, my sister Eunice was in Wisconsin, my wife, Jackie. My two brothers are in Wisconsin, Bobby, who's really in sort of directing our effort there, and my brother Teddy's there, except his wife's about to have a baby.
Every member of the Kennedy family soon realized that they were facing widespread prejudice against their Irish Catholic roots. Religion, it turned out, was the sleeping issue of the campaign, and ultimately Jack Kennedy was forced to confront it head-on.
If this election is decided on the basis that 40 million Americans lost their chance of being president on the day they were baptized, then it is the whole nation that will be the loser in the eyes of Catholics and non-Catholics around the world, in the eyes of history, and in the eyes of our own people. I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic.
I'm walking down to Washington to shake hands with President.
His victory in November 1960 was a victory for all Roman Catholics, but it was a special vindication for Jack's family. At the inauguration, one of every 7 people on the podium was a Kennedy.
So help you God.
So help me God.
His father had made just one request of the president-elect, that his brother Bobby, who had served as his campaign manager, be a member of his cabinet. "It's the only thing I'm asking for," he said, "and I want it."
For Jack, it was a leap of faith, and he decided that the best place was in the Department of Justice. He acted against all the advice that other people poured in on him about justice. You must get someone learned in the law. I wrote that myself, among others. Bob Kennedy had never practiced law, but he was an exceedingly effective attorney general and was totally loyal. He was not only a brother, he was a brother in an established hierarchy in a family that in some ways was an old, ancient Irish tribe. His loyalty could be counted on completely.
Jack Kennedy's presidency got off to a disastrous start. At the urging of a team of experts, including the director of the CIA, he approved a plan for a secret invasion of Cuba. Of the 1,450 soldiers who were landed at the Bay of Pigs, all but 150 were captured or killed.
It's a tremendous change to go from being a senator to being president. But much easier to make the speeches than it is to finally make the judgments. Because unfortunately, your advisors are frequently divided. If you take the wrong course, and on occasion I have, the president bears the burden, responsibility quite rightly.
Kennedy vowed never again to be swayed by advisors, and increasingly he came to place his trust in loyal family members. To those around him, his family seemed linked to everything he did. When he dealt with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, He said it was like dealing with Dad, all give and no take. Upon hearing that construction of the Berlin Wall had gotten underway, Kennedy's first words were, "Go get Bobby." When he established the Peace Corps, he announced his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, would run it. And he turned to his wife to transform the White House into a center of culture.
Vice President once said the only thing keeping us going are not the programs, but my wife and Caroline, but we believe that the programs are also important.
Throughout Kennedy's presidency, the public got memorable glimpses of his family life. And even as the Cold War grew critically dangerous, the president rarely showed any signs of the pressure he was under.
My perception of President Kennedy is that he grew enormously in office. The Bay of Pigs in the first 3 months of his administration was a matter of not understanding what he got himself into. It was a transition blunder. He learned a great deal from that, and it shaped a lot of his behavior after in foreign relations, right up to and including the Cuban Missile Crisis. His presidency may have contributed somewhat to creating the crisis. That can't be denied. But once the crisis was upon him, he acted in an enormously careful and responsible way. It was certainly Jack Kennedy's finest hour.
Kennedy's success in getting nuclear missiles removed from Cuba during the October crisis in 1962 occurred largely because this time he relied primarily on his own judgment, sending his brother Bobby behind the scenes to open a direct line of communication with the Soviet Union. And by making direct contact, Kennedy was able to diffuse the single most dangerous confrontation of the nuclear age.
I think looking back in Cuba, what is of concern is the fact that both governments were so far out of contact. The final judgment of anybody in an administration in the 60s, and I think that that's the test, not any other test, is have the vital interests of the United States been protected? Has peace been maintained? Is there greater stability in the world than when he came in? And did all citizens participate more fully in the life of the country? Now, that's what I'll rest on whenever I'm finished.
In the summer before his assassination, President Kennedy made a sentimental journey. His father was unable to travel with him. Having suffered a stroke, he was unable to walk or talk, unable to give any more advice. Now, Kennedy was off to his ancestral homeland, to Ireland, where he was mobbed by adoring crowds.
Here he was, Jack Kennedy, the first Irish Catholic president of the United States, fulfilling his father's ambitions for him, for his family, indeed for the Irish in America. Here he was, back on the ancestral soil, being greeted by the entire population of the island as a hero, as their hero, their special hero. It moved him profoundly. It was, in a way, completing the circle.
There is an impression in Washington that there are no Kennedys left in Ireland, that they're all in Washington. And so I wonder if there are any Kennedys in this audience. Could you hold up your hand so I can see? Well, I'm glad to see a few cousins who didn't catch the boat. We're glad If you ever come to America, Becaith Mille Falchi, which means in Gaelic 100,000 welcomes.
Americans have had just a handful of presidents who were seemingly born for office. Most of America's presidents still come from humble origins. Bill Clinton was the son of a traveling salesman, Jimmy Carter of a peanut farmer. Richard Nixon's father owned a gas station. But as the George Bush family most recently illustrates, there is also a tradition which might be called the American royalty.
Americans really adore having native aristocrats as presidents, provided the aristocrats know how to conduct themselves in the office and have a popular touch. Without that common touch, aristocracy in and of itself is not an advantage.
It occurs only 2 or 3 times a century. But when a powerful family is successful in the presidency, that dynasty can take hold of the country's imagination and not let go for a very long time.